This is John Johnson and Chris Fabian here in Denver, and we appreciate this opportunity to present, even though it isn't live, but to give you the end results of the work that we've been doing in phase 2 of priority-based budgeting with the City of Chandler. And I think we've got some exciting enhancements that have been made through some of the work that we've been doing with Dawn and Greg and your HR department in terms of the whole modeling of employee succession planning, your employee analysis, that I think is going to even be more helpful. It's certainly made the model richer, and certainly be something that we'll be demonstrating to other communities who are also looking for effective ways to better understand how they're going to plan for things like vacancies, retirements, and other succession planning tools. So we're again very excited that we're able to join you at least through the video. We know that Greg and Dawn are well versed in the model as well, but hopefully if you have any questions following our presentation, they can give you some insights, but we'll certainly be available later in the week if those questions we need to have some further discussion. So without further ado, we're just going to remind you a little bit about what phase 2 was really all about. Then we'll give kind of a quick overview of how we've gotten here to this final end result with the resource alignment, diagnostic alignment tool that we're going to be showing you. And then we'll go into previewing the model itself to give you ideas about how this information can be used effectively, not to cut the budget, but to simply determine where are our resources going and how could we better utilize those resources to achieve the results that we have identified are important to our community, and where are those opportunities to find those savings and efficiencies that can help us put those dollars to things that are of a much higher value to all of us as we try to determine the best utilization of our dollars and of our staff.
So as we started phase 2 with you all this year, we had a couple of clear objectives. You've all been through the process once already. Well, most of you. I'm sure some of you in the room, this was your first experience in priority-based budgeting. But we really wanted to give everybody an opportunity, now that you know what this is all about, to revise your program inventories. We wanted an opportunity to refine the way that you go about developing program costs and make sure that there was a consistent methodology taken to develop those program costs. And we're going to get into that in just a few slides. And we also wanted an opportunity to refresh those program scores. We heard during the first go-around that this is a new process. You're talking about your programs and their influence on results in an entirely new way, and not just one result that your programs best fit to, but all the results that you're trying to achieve in the City of Chandler. So to allow you to refresh those program scores, applying more of a consistent methodology and approach to the way that you went through program scoring was really critical. We wanted to give more time this go around in the process to consider all of the results and certainly to make sure that everybody had a clear understanding of what those basic program attributes were all about. Again, those additional scoring criteria like mandates, cost recovery, those things that also make programs relevant. And then finally, the opportunity to take more time for peer review and to have real thoughtful discussions about the programs that you're reviewing, and be consistent in that approach as well. We've seen as organizations go through their second and even third years in this process that the peer review component of it becomes far more rich. You're really looking at these programs and considering, do they truly meet these results, and how do we know? So the opportunity that you took this year to really devote to peer review was critical. And then lastly, to make full use of the tool. We have now gone through your second phase of developing these program costs, and we've loaded the model, and that's where we're going to spend some time today teaching you how to start to use the model, how to start to uncover some of those questions that get to, just as John put it, opportunities to consider new choices you might make for resource reallocation. So overall, for those of you who have memorized the 5 steps of the process, this will probably be very familiar to you. But we wanted to remind everybody, this is the logic overall, the process for priority-based budgeting that begins with results and our definitions for results, those remained unchanged this year. What we really focused on were those areas in the yellow highlight. Again, revising programs, consistent methodology to program costing, scoring and peer review, and ultimately the development of the resource alignment diagnostic tool. Okay, so program scoring. Everybody remembers how program scoring took place. The departments get to score their own programs, and that's critical because we know that departments know the most about the programs that they provide. So that remains a critical aspect to the process. And then in peer review, the key to peer review is that a jury of your peers is left to consider the programs and really have a thoughtful discussion about whether or not they believe that the programs achieve the results as identified.
I think that with peer review, we just want to again emphasize that it is a critical part of the process. And we know that it is important that we get the feedback from the departments in the scoring, but for this process to be able to move forward and to demonstrate credibility, validity to those outside of the organization especially, but even to our elected officials, as we start making choices and recommendations based on the way the prioritization model has been developed, we want to be sure that there's the assurance that there was some quality control and that there was some validation, that a second set of eyes has looked at these particular programs that are maybe unfamiliar just to determine, does that score seem reasonable based on their understanding of the results and what they believe that program is to achieve. It's not meant to override the department, but simply to help validate that the department's way of thinking is truly correct. And in peer review, we've seen scores increase as well as decrease. So it is another way for someone outside of the department with a little fresher perspective, a different perspective, to take a look at those programs and also be able to step back and say, relative to everything else we do in the city, does this program seem as important in terms of where it has been scored? And that's the important part. The departments are scoring within their own area. So they may assign a score that then, if you're looking at, for example, safe community, it may be viewed that of all the programs offered across the city, that relative to each other, this one program should be viewed a little higher or perhaps should be viewed a little lower compared to those other areas. So it's another way of being able to just determine the relative value of the programs, not meaning that we're trying to say this program is unimportant, but looking for that relative value of the program and its relative achievement of the results compared to what we're looking at across the board. Now, the other thing that peer review will do, it is also beginning of an important part of what all of us in local government are striving for, and that's the introduction of performance measures and metrics. And this is a way for us to test, are the measures and metrics that we're using to demonstrate that a program is effectively achieving the result, are those measures and metrics convincing? Are those measures and metrics appropriate? And by using peer review, this is a safe internal way to test those metrics before we actually introduce them externally to the organization, so that we can, again, understand what are those measures that will convince folks that aren't as familiar with our programs that we are truly achieving the result we're trying to offer. So for all those reasons, we truly believe that peer review is not only worthwhile, but it's critical to the successful outcomes of the priority-based budgeting process.
Now, one thing in the first phase that we didn't spend a lot of time going through was the mechanics of how do we go from peer review, these 0 to 4 scoring scales, to the placement of a program in a quartile. And we wanted to spend just a little bit of time making sure that everybody was clear on that, how that process takes place, because that's a little bit of the work that John and I do to calculate final scores and then to actually produce an analysis that differentiates the programs and places them into these quartile groupings. So the first concept here is to recognize that the final score that a program receives is an indication, it's reflective of how influential that program is relative to your results. In addition, it reflects how well the program met your basic program attributes. We have the second concept where results are actually worth more than the the attributes, and we want to actually explain that. As John and I developed this process, we realized that if we simply added up all the scores, just took all the scores for basic program attributes and all the scores that the program had for achieving results, we could come up with a final score that way. However, what would come of that is that a program could very well end up in a higher quartile simply because one of those basic program attributes. So we might have a program that ends up being quartile 1 simply because it's mandated or because it recovers its own costs. Instead, we made a conscious decision. We wanted the quartile placement to be far more reflective of how well the program influenced your results, whereas those basic program attributes were additional characteristics that could help a program score. They're certainly important overall to the program relevance, but they weren't as important as the program's influence on the results. So how do we achieve that? You remember in the program scorecard, there are the categories where the program achieves basic program attributes, and then there's the scoring that takes place relative to results. We actually apply a slight weighting factor to bump up the scores where the program influences results. If you can imagine a perfect scoring program, it scored 4s for all of the categories, every basic program attribute and every one of the results. We make sure in the end that 2/3 of a program's final score comes from its influence on results, and 1/3, as you see in those scales, comes from its influence on the basic program attributes. So this basic idea of a 2/3, 1/3 weighting factor increases the scores that your program has to influence results and makes that the primary determination of how the program ends up in a quartile. Lastly, once we have those final scores, we take all the scores that you have and we apply an analysis that's exactly analogous to grading a set of test scores on a curve. And that's what we're going to get into as you see this next slide. This is actually all of your community-oriented programs in the city of Chandler, where each one of these horizontal lines represents one of your programs and its final score. Now, the last thing that we do is normalize this to a scale of 100 so that a perfect program you can imagine would be 100 points on the dot. That's 4s in every category. And you didn't have any perfect programs. We've never seen one so far, so that's okay. But you do have many programs that scored there all the way up towards the mid-80s, some programs here that scored in the mid-70s, and then a host of programs that scored all the way from about 50 to 65. These are your highest scoring programs. They're your highest scoring programs relative to everything else that you offer. And you see that they're differentiated from this next tier of programs. These also scored pretty well. They scored from just shy of 50 all the way down to about 40 points, and you have 92 programs here. That's what we call quartile 2. And we make a distinction between your highest scoring programs and your next tier of programs. And then you have quartile 3 and quartile 4. One of the key things to realize here is that there aren't the same amount of programs in each quartile. You see there's 78 programs in quartile 1, and there's 92 programs in quartile 2, 104 programs in quartile 3, and 31 programs in quartile 4. How do we get there? Well, we go about it in 2 ways. And one of the ways is to apply an analysis of standard deviation, where we're literally looking at your entire population of programs, calculating the mean, and looking at what it means to be one standard deviation removed from the mean. So we are taking a statistical view, just like you would in a bell curve of your entire program population. And then we also look at what are the top 25% of programs and the second 25% of programs. And we start to study where is there a statistically meaningful break in the scores so that we can draw the line between quartile 1 and quartile 2. Now, imagine a different approach that we could have taken. If we would have simply stopped at looking at the top 25% of your programs and calling those quartile 1, and then calling the next 25% of your programs quartile 2, the third 25% of your programs quartile 3, and the final 25% of your programs quartile 4, there would be equal numbers of programs within each quartile. Our problem with that, where John and I decided that's not the best way to break up the quartiles, is that What if a program that was the 25th percentage ended up in quartile 1, and it had the exact same score as the program that ended up as the 26th percentage that goes to quartile 2? That wouldn't make sense to us. There's no difference between those programs, and therefore, why would we arbitrarily draw a line that divided the quartiles there? That's where the statistical approach has made sense.
And I think you'll see very simply from your model, if we'd gone 25% in each of the quartiles, quartile 4 would certainly be a lot larger because it would have to have more programs. And so it really makes sense in this analysis to try to come up with those breaks. But remember, this isn't a ranking system where it matters which program scored number 76 compared to the program that scored number 75. We group them together because the ones in quartile 1, quartile 2, quartile 3, and quartile 4, those programs are similar in relative importance. And again, remember, it's important. This is the relative importance as we compare everything you do. Doesn't mean that programs in quartile 4 should never have been done, are stupid, are worthless. It just means that relative to the things that we do across the entire organization, there are those programs that meet our results to a higher degree, thus quartile 1. Remember, quartile 2 also represents significantly important programs. It's when you get into quartile 3 that you start seeing a lower degree of relevance with quartile 4 with an even lesser degree of relevance. It's also important that we point out that because we had different scoring criteria for community programs and governance programs, they are scored separately in terms of calculating this quartile placement, because the ranges don't necessarily coincide, simply because we have perhaps, in your case, more governance results to score against than community results. So we want to be sure we're developing two separate scoring arrays and evaluating community programs against each other and governance programs against each other, but not mixing those and evaluating all programs the same, simply because the scoring criteria has been a little different and we want to calculate each of these in a separate way. I think that will become more clear as Chris goes through the rest of the calculations and how we get to the final model.
So now that every program is put into a quartile, this is where the program costs come into play to finish off the array. So we get all the information that we need for the model. And the process that you went through this year, there are only a small handful of the priority-based budgeting communities who have applied this consistent approach to program costing that you did. So you're to be commended. It was excellent work that you did. You also went one step further to apply workforce data, which we're going to get into when we actually display the model. But the idea with program costing is to literally go through all of the personnel and recognize that your staff spend their time supporting many different programs in some cases. And so the idea that we can take a staff, a certain position, and allocate them to one or many programs, that's the process that you went through. So with the allocation of personnel costs and non-personnel costs, we developed a complete understanding of your program costs. So when we applied those program costs to each one of the programs in the quartiles, we could come back to an ultimate spending array and see where the city's resources are currently being allocated. So this is, again, a continuation of those community-oriented programs that we were looking at. So you see the same numbers, 78 in quartile 1, 92 in quartile 2, 104 programs in quartile 3, and 31 programs in quartile 4. And you can see here, with the program costs associated with the program, here is what your spending array looks like. So it's at this point we're going to actually transition into the live display of the resource alignment diagnostic tool, but hopefully at this point you have a pretty solid understanding of how we get from program scoring in the peer review process all the way to the development of the tool that we're about to unveil. So here is the exact picture that we were just looking at a moment ago, and you can see that we've highlighted community-oriented programs. So this is the same array. We're going to walk you through each of these filters to teach you how to use it and show you what the filters reveal. Just as John talked about, governance programs went through the exact same process, and as we differentiated the governance programs overall. Here is their array. And the key to this is, as we're looking at governance programs versus community-oriented programs, it's not that community programs are more important than governance programs or governance are more important than community. Each of them had scoring criteria, and they were each differentiated into those quartiles, which help us understand overall relevance. So you see within governance, we have quartile 1 and quartile 2, and within community-oriented programs, we also have all of the same quartiles, and we can put them together to see an overall citywide perspective, realizing that, hey, quartile 1 is quartile 1. It's just an indication of how well you met the scoring criteria. So this is an overall perspective of the entire city.
Now you look at this view and you wonder, is this good, is this bad? And we would say that overall, you again have a fairly healthy spending profile. 65% of your total spending is going to quartile 1 and 2, where about 35% is going to quartile 3 and 4. That's a fairly standard allocation. In fact, it's a little better than we've seen. We just finished a model for Douglas County, Nevada. Their split was 60-40, with 60% of their budget going to their quartile 1 and 2. So it is demonstrating the majority of your spending is going towards quartile 1 and 2, but you're still seeing in this model that you have opportunities in quartile 3 and 4, and that's what we're going to educate you on. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that your community programs represent about 88% of your budget, where the spending on your governance programs represents about 12%. And we think, again, that this is a nice representation. Many communities, that governance spending is a little bit higher percentage-wise compared to the total budget. So again, reminding you as well, we're only looking at your one-time operating costs, the capital costs, your one-time initiatives have been taken out because, again, we're only looking at your programs. And so what we want to do now is walk through a little bit more detail what the particular filters look like and how you can use this to look at your budget, not just from this vantage point, but from several different perspectives in which to influence the recommendations that you might make about how you should spend your resources.
So the first filter we want to show you allows us to take a perspective on any of your accounting funds. So say we wanted to look at just the general fund, we can take a perspective on the model that only pulls out those resources that are general fund dollars. So as you see here, and as John reveals percentages, you can draw your attention down here to see percentage of the total city budget. But as we're looking at the general fund array out of the entire citywide array, here are those particular resources. So you see, again, this is a pretty healthy array overall. And if we wanted to just focus in on how we're going to balance the general fund, we can just pick this one particular view. Another fund, and just to be illustrative, we're not going to show you all of them, but let's take a look at the water operating fund. Many organizations ask us as they get into this process, why don't we just look at the general fund alone? Why do we involve some of these other accounting funds that are more self-sustaining? And this one's a perfect case in point. Here's your water operating fund. And as you can see here, as their programs have gone through the priority-based budgeting process, yes, they have a very healthy spending array as well, but they too, even within water, have quartile 3 and quartile 4 programs that might raise opportunities for them to consider resource reallocation. We certainly encourage, as we do in other organizations, that before it's automatic that you'd go out for a rate increase for the water utility, that you take a look at some of those lower priority programs and make sure that all of these are absolutely necessary. So this is why within any of your special revenue funds, within any of your enterprise funds, we strongly encourage, this is why it's so important to do this at a citywide level. We'll show you one other fund just so you kind of get the picture. Your HURF fund.
And this represents, mainly those monies that are coming from your highway user taxes, your highway user funds from another agency that are helping you fund mainly your transportation projects. Now, we really encourage looking at the funds because when you do have special revenues that are coming in to cover certain functions, it's also important to demonstrate that it doesn't just have to be, those are monies that we don't talk about because they can only be used for a very specific thing. We want to concentrate on trying to utilize those resources to our best ability to also be highly relevant to our organization. Now here, you'll see that in this particular category, a great deal of the programs that are accounted for in this fund are also highly relevant. They're transportation programs. But why? It's not because they're mandated. It's not because that there's a dedicated revenue stream. It's because that those programs are highly influential in achieving the results. Not only your transportation results, but if you study your result maps, they have an impact on your healthy and attractive community, because one of the ways you achieve a healthy and attractive community is to have a structurally sound and enhanced public infrastructure. It also highly influences your safe community, because safe roadways, well-maintained transportation system was a way you defined a safe community. It also has a huge amount to do with sustainable economic health, because you really want to be sure that you're expanding your infrastructure to meet the needs, and that you are offering efficient, affordable, and responsive infrastructure that meets the needs of the community. And so it's not just that this is a dedicated revenue stream. It's that these programs that are in quartile 1 and 2 highly achieve all of the results, a multiple number of results, not just transportation. But there are still areas in quartile 3 that you may study these programs to determine, could we use these resources that will actually help us meet the overall objectives of our organization to a higher degree. So even this fund demonstrates that a dedicated revenue stream, there are opportunities to study the programs in quartile 3 and determine, is there a better utilization of these dedicated resources to help us more achieve the results overall that we want from our organization.
I'm going to go back to an overall citywide perspective. I think everybody gets the idea that we can break this down by accounting fund. And this third filter allows us to start to sift through and filter through the data based on the department. So clearly, for your own department, this is where you're going to begin to pick out how your particular array turned out.
So what we're going to do is just very quickly walk through each of these so you can get a basic glimpse where, of course, today isn't the day that you can study everything. This gives you the beginning of the conversations and where your opportunities. So we look at buildings and facilities. This represents all programs across all funds, both governance and community. So you can see that profile. Then we'll go to the city clerk. Then we'll go to the city manager's office. We'll go to communications and public affairs. Then next is community services, followed by downtown redevelopment. Next, economic development. Then we'll go to fire. Then we go to human resources, information technology, law, your magistrate, management services, municipal utilities, neighborhood services, police, and finally, transportation and development. And I think what you'll see is everyone demonstrates they offer highly relevant programs, but there are also opportunities within every department to look for ways that the resources might be better utilized, thus shifting those resources out of quartile 3 and 4. But this is just the starting point of the conversation. You don't have to settle anything today. This is just giving you your first view of your profile so that the discussions can begin on what that profile means to your department and what are the ways that you can explore the opportunities to make some changes in that particular profile. Now, the next filter, we have on here direct costs. What will be put in the model by next week will be all of those administrative costs in your departments that did not go through scoring, but those costs needed to be added to the programs that those administrative functions oversee. So right now we're only looking at the direct costs without the administrative costs, so you can get a better feel. When the final model is complete and you get your own individual department models, we will also have those administrative costs built in. But this filter also lets you take out what we call program revenues. And when you did your program costing, you identified that there was about $8.4 million in monies that come in that are meant to pay for or reimburse the city for the costs to provide that program. Could be fees for services, it could be grants, but you've identified that there are revenues that come in that can only be used to fund a program. Thus, if the program doesn't exist, the revenues don't exist either. We think this is important so that as we're making choices and as we're talking about the reallocation of resources, we understand what revenues are coming in for which we don't have any choice but to spend them on these programs. Now, we'll talk a little bit later about what it means to have program revenues in quartiles 3 and 4. It simply means we need to explore these, and those programs specifically need to make sure they're covering most of their costs, including those indirect administrative choices. But we'll talk about that a little ways more. There's some other filters in this area. I think we're going to come back to those because this will talk about the most important enhancements. Let's go through and talk about our filters very quickly, and then come back and talk about your new addition to this model with succession planning. I think that the flow will help you see how this works and how you can utilize this new functionality that no other community that has implemented priority-based budgeting has available to them. So let's look at how the filters work, and Chris is going to explain how that information that we've accumulated in program scoring can now also help you see this budget through a completely different perspective.
I think everybody saw what I just did. This is an Excel spreadsheet, and the primary tab is your dashboard. That's where we continue to focus our conversation. But as you move over to the second tab called Filter Options, just like John said, this is where we can start to put to use all of the information that has come together by virtue of your participation in program scoring. So the program scoring process isn't done solely to put a program in a quartile. Yes, all of these characteristics of programs help us understand the overall relevance and therefore help us put the program in a quartile, but we've also put all this information at play in this filter options page so that you can start to dive into this, as John said, start to look at your own array from several different angles and raise pertinent questions. The first area that, just to be illustrative, we're going to spend some time walking you through is this basic program attribute category. Is the city mandated to provide a service? And we're going to walk through each of the scores so you can see what results from the array, and also how to start looking at these combinations of filters to ask specific questions.
And this is illustrative. This is an exercise that we encourage you to go through for every one of these basic attributes, but we'll show you how to think in terms of using mandates. And I think, as you remember in the program scoring, there are various levels of mandate that we want to recognize. The first being, the highest level is this required of us by a higher level agency, federal, state, or perhaps even county. So if we set the filter as equal to 4, we're going to see what the profile looks like for all programs that scored a 4, meaning they are required of us by a federal, state, or county legislation. Now, as you can see, this is an interesting profile. It represents about 39% of your budget, so maybe a little less than what we might expect. In a county government we just came from, it was much, much higher. Over 50% of their budget was mandates. We find in cities that this is a pretty reasonably accurate viewpoint in terms of we don't have as many federal and state mandates as maybe someone believes. But what do you see in this picture? The majority of the spending is going towards quartile 1 and 2. The programs didn't achieve that status because they're mandated. They achieved the status because they also are helping us achieve the results that the city wants to achieve, and perhaps is meeting several other of the basic attributes. But you can see the majority of the spending in your mandated programs is going to things that are highly relevant. So sometimes we get caught up in the feeling that mandates are bad and should be just eliminated. In this case, we would probably be doing the programs or something similar that are in quartile 1 and 2. So we don't want to indicate that mandated programs are bad. But conversely, you've got a little over $14 million in programs that are in quartile 3 and 4. What does this mean, even if they're mandated? It truly means that we need to study these programs because they are not as relevant to us in achieving the results that our community wants from us. And so while we may be required to do them, it's important that we study, are we doing more than we're required to do? Read the mandate, understand the mandate, and discuss whether or not we should be delivering more service than is required by the mandate. In other words, can we do the minimum level of service that meets the results of the mandate that frees up resources to use for things that are more important to us? You may even want to be able to outline what are the penalties, what are the consequences for not doing something that's mandated. It's not something that we'd advocate, but at least have the conversation so that when someone asks you what happens if we don't fulfill this mandate, that answer has already been clear. Quartile 1 and 2, it's not about mandate, it's about those are important to us in achieving results. Quartile 3 and 4, let's be sure we know what's the minimum level of service, what's the consequences for not delivering service, and then have the conversation, what level of service are we comfortable with offering and still achieving the outcomes we want. Now if we go to the filter and say, let's change this to equal to 3, that really talks about programs that are outlined for us in our city charter, in corporation documents, or perhaps we have some compliance requirements from another regulatory agency because we've chosen to do certain programs. Well, again, most of the spending highly relevant to the other results. So those are probably programs, even though we're mandated by the city charter to do them, we would want to do them because they're important. But again, the caution, about $800,000 in quartiles 3 and 4, study those and make sure we're not over-delivering and that we're doing those for the right reasons, and make sure we're not putting more resources there than are absolutely necessary to meet the regulatory or charter requirement. A mandate equal to 2 was something that is in a formally adopted the city code, an ordinance, a resolution, or a policy that's been adopted by your city council. Now again, you can see a lot of spending in quartile 1 and 2, but there is a significant amount of spending also showing up in quartile 3. These are self-imposed mandates. There are things that we have legislated ourselves and required ourselves to do. Great story, we just came back from Douglas County, Nevada, where they were studying this and saw some significant spending going on in quartile 3 that was required by their own city ordinance, their own city code, or their own city policies. Their task was, let's look at these and figure out perhaps these are outdated or written documents that are no longer relevant to our needs. So let's study them and decide, do we still need to legislate locally that we're performing these programs? They came up with the fact that there was one program, very low relevance, but it was just in their city code, and as they studied it, it wasn't a problem anymore. It was dealing with home occupational permits. They were spending a lot of dollars and resources to check on home beauty parlors, home mechanics, home sales, and they realized that there wasn't a problem. They didn't have a lot of these things, but they were devoting a lot of their inspectors to dealing with that. But they weren't spending a lot of time in another area, which was vacation rentals, which Douglas County is located near Lake Tahoe. And they were having significant problems. And so what they did was they lessened the spending in quartile 3 by doing away with the home occupancy permit, the home occupational business permits, and used those resources to spend on regulating vacation rentals, which also generated their lodging tax because vacation rentals were just like motels. they needed to generate revenue, and this was missing revenue. So just by having this discussion of, are we doing things that are still relevant, they could reshift those resources from quartile 3 and 4. So we challenge everyone, look at the requirements for those programs in quartile 3 and 4, and really get to the bottom of, are these still something we want to self-impose, or are there better ways we could use those resources? Mandate equal to 1 simply says that we recognize that there are best practices from our professional organizations that we want to follow. But again, looking at this, there's a significant amount that we've designated as best practices that are in quartile 3 and 4. We look at these and want to make sure that the cost of following the best practice makes sense in terms of the way we're using those dollars and the results we're trying to achieve. Perhaps this is a best practice that isn't as applicable to our community because it's not relevant to our results. It's not important to us. So again, here's a group of programs that would be worth looking at to determine if it's just a best practice, but it's not relevant to our outcomes and our results and our goals. Maybe it's a best practice that we as a community don't necessarily need to follow because it's not as important as other communities that find it would help them also achieve their higher results. Mandate equal to 0 is simply there isn't any kind of written documentation, regulations, best practice. There's no written reason that tells us we need to do it. And again, it isn't surprising that most of these programs fall in quartile 3 and 4. These are also worth studying. Nobody is requiring us to do it. We're not even requiring themselves through written legislation, and our professional organizations aren't saying that we should be doing this. So we should understand in quartile 3 and 4, why are we offering these programs when there's no one that's requiring us to do so? These are clearly programs we offer by choice with no other written or outside requirement.
So we hope you can see, just using mandate as an example, each of these criteria, when you focus in on them, brings up a whole host of questions that are specific to that particular criteria. And we urge you to walk through each of the other criteria, really thinking this through. What does it mean? What are we looking at? What does it mean to be high priority for that criteria? What does it mean to be lower on the relevance scale? And what questions does that bring up? And we're going to show you some more examples as we go. Moving on from mandates, and we're going to return to it momentarily as we start to show you how you can put combinations of filters at play. We wanted to focus on another example, the reliance on the city to provide a particular service. Now, just to remind everybody, this was not a question of outsourcing. We weren't simply asking, can the city choose to outsource the program, or should the city use city staff to provide the program? That wasn't the focus at all. Instead, what we're trying to understand with this question is, are citizens entirely reliant on you as a service provider to receive a particular program, whether they outsource it or not, versus do the citizens have other opportunities to receive a service, be it from the public sector, another public sector service provider, or even from the private sector? So that's what we're trying to understand with this particular question. The first criteria that we're going to look at is reliance equal to 3. Now, if you remember from the scoring criteria what that meant, a reliance equal to 4 was identifying that indeed the city is the only possible service provider. With reliance equal to 3, we're opening up the door that there are other public service entities who provide the program beyond just the city. So as we come back to the main page and we see the overall spending array, a couple of things come to mind. Just like John walked you through with the mandated category, when we see a highly relevant program that another public service entity is providing, what occurs to us is you as a city, you very much care about this program. It's achieving your results. You want it to be preserved. But simply by identifying that somebody else is also in this business raises the question, is there potentially a public-public partnership that could emerge? It's very important to you. Somebody else is providing it in the public sector. Let's explore the potential for a public-public partnership. So many organizations ask us, if a program ends up in quartile 1 or quartile 2, Should we just put it off the table? It's no longer worthy of discussion. And we say, well, it's highly relevant to you, but we ought to explore, can we do this differently? Is there an efficiency issue that we can identify? And this is a prime example. Look for a partnership. On the other hand, in the lower quartile areas where it's less relevant to our results, the question emerges, are we sure that we need to be providing this particular program, especially when there's another public entity who is providing that program overall? So that's reliance equal to 3. And again, just illustrating for you the different ways to go about asking those questions. Now we can ask a different question. We can say, let's look at reliance less than 3. And what we're identifying here, this could have been, these are programs that could have scored 0, 1, or 2 in the reliance category. They just didn't score 3 or 4. And as we start to get to those lower areas of reliance, 0s, 1s, and 2s, we've identified in this case that not only is there another public sector entity possibly providing the program, but there could be other private sector entities providing the program as well within your community. So there are plenty of different options for citizens to potentially consider.
And I think what's important here is this is demonstrating, again, you've got a wide array, about 20% of your budget also represent programs that are offered by the private sector. $47 million. We think that this is an indication of potentially programs in which you're competing with the private sector. Now again, as Chris said, those that are in quartiles 1 and 2 also are achieving a result. So they're very important, and you may be delivering a higher quality service than what the private sector can offer. And so it's important that you evaluate, is the private sector the best service delivery for the results you're trying to accomplish? But when you get into quartile 3 and 4, and again, this is starting to look at some significant dollar amounts, you should be asking the question, if there's a private sector provider and this isn't achieving our results, would we be better off trying to determine whether or not they should just be allowed to offer that service and for us to not provide that service anymore? Now again, we're not looking at quartile 3 and 4 to cut the budget. We're looking at quartiles 3 and 4 to say, why are we spending our dollars in things that aren't relevant to our organization? Let's figure out a different way to use those dollars. And so it's more about shifting the dollars than cutting the dollars. And in this case, those private partnerships, those turning some of these things over to the private sector would free up those dollars for use in new programs and things that are much more relevant to the overall objectives the City of Chandler wants to achieve.
So let's move on from reliance and look at another of the basic program attributes, change in demand for the service. Now, in this category, we allowed scores that were actually negative, where it indicated that there was actually a decrease in demand overall for the particular service. So we turn on this filter, we're looking at programs that scored less than 0 overall for change in demand.
And again, here you'll see that this represents about 6% of the budget, and it's a significant enough dollar amount that we think it's important. You've identified that these are programs in which you're seeing the demand, the need for those programs going down. And so the first question is, could we do them with less resources? Again, freeing up the resources to use in other ways. Because the majority of these programs are in quartile 3 and 4, it's worthy of the conversation to determine, well, we might not get out of the business entirely. Do we need the same level of resources that we previously had when we're experiencing a change in demand that is decreasing? And so we challenge you to study these programs to determine, could we do them with less resources? Or again, because they are of less relevance to us overall, are they things that perhaps we can partner, get out of the business of doing, or even start having discussions of whether we could charge a fee if we need to continue to offer those programs. But again, challenging you to look at these filters and having the conversations with the programs that come out in each of these filters.
The next thing that we want to show you is that you can put combinations of these filters, you can turn them on at the exact same time. So let's go back to what we were just discussing a moment ago in terms of this reliance on the city to provide a program. And if we went back to that reliance less than 3 overall, remember that we were looking at programs that there's public sector providing the program, there's the private sector providing that program. Well, we might ask a follow-up question to that. Well, what if some of these programs are mandated, and that's why we're providing them? Yeah, there's another service provider, but we're doing it because we're mandated to provide the program. Well, we can take those out. Because remember up here in the other attribute, mandated to provide the service, we can say let's only return programs that scored less than 3 in mandated. And when we turn both of these filters on at the same time, we're looking at programs that others are providing. They scored less than 3 in reliance, and we're not mandated to do it, at least strongly mandated. These programs that scored less than 3, if anything, it was one of those self-imposed mandates that John described. So as we come back to the picture, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at programs that we're not required to do by any sort of mandate except for our own, and others are providing them overall.
But let's say that some of these programs, maybe we are collecting a fee to pay for them, or there's a grant. So let's take out those program revenues and just look at programs that are offered that we're not mandated to do unless it's a self-imposed mandate, that are not relevant to our results, if you look at quartile 3 and 4, that are offered by someone in the private sector, and we're not collecting any type of revenue. We're using our taxes to support. This is a pretty interesting picture, and one, again, that we would say quartile 1 and 2 are demonstrating some relevance to the results. So we're not ready to really dig into those, but certainly we need to analyze those programs in quartiles 3 and 4 because they're not helping us achieve our results. And for all the other reasons, are perfect opportunities to perhaps shift those resources to things that are more important. Even in good times, even in times of increasing revenues, we should be looking at those programs and understanding why are we offering these. At the minimum, shouldn't we at least be charging a fee because we've said that these are programs being offered by the private sector. They're not using tax dollars to offer them. They're charging the end user to pay for that service. So it at least gives us the conversation about fees, but it should also lead to a conversation about, are these the things that we're in business to do, and couldn't we use these resources far better to achieve the results our community expects from us as a city organization?
Now I'm going to restore this back to the all filters off as we change direction from the basic program attributes and get into a discussion that focuses more on the results, because we can run the filters at the result level as well. Now, one of the questions that's always intriguing to us is, are we offering any programs that they just aren't helping us achieve any of the results, at least to a high level? We're turning off every one of these, or turning on, I should say, every one of these filters that says less than 3 in the result areas, both community-oriented results as well as governance results, so that the programs that come back could not score any higher than 2 in any of the result areas, therefore meaning not a high influence on any one of your results. So this is the last one. And as we come back to the main picture, I've got all of these turned to yes, except for the null. What we're about to see are programs that do not have a high impact on any of the results that the City of Chandler is in business to achieve.
And you can see, again, about 9% of your budget, or in this case, about 83 programs that have been identified that aren't truly relevant to any of the results that you're trying to achieve. Again, another perspective, another picture, that it isn't that we're saying these are bad, these are horrible, they need to be cut immediately, but they're worth the conversation. They're worth the study to understand why would we be in this business when they're not helping us achieve any of the results we believe we're in business to achieve. If we were in private business, these would be product lines that we would question, are they something that we really should continue to do? So we would want to analyze these in terms of, are we charging fees for them? Are they mandated? We need to get a better handle, but it is an area where we encourage you to study. Now, those that are in quartile 1 and 2 probably achieve a little bit of the results, but they probably are meeting all of the basic attributes. You can see there are a few of them, but again, they're worth study because we want to understand why are we offering them if they're not achieving our results. But I think you can see there's quite a bit of opportunity for study if we just focused on these in quartile 3 and 4 and came up with some ideas about how better could we use that close to $20 million in resources that I think all of us could list today what a better use of those dollars would be.
All right. And as I turn these off, one more result filter that we're going to show you is how we can focus in on any one particular result at a time and really ask the question, what are all of the programs that are helping us achieve this result to the greatest extent possible? So I'm turning these off just as fast as I can. But we're going to focus on, let's look at safe community. It's a result that everybody's probably familiar with in terms of its definition and what we're trying to achieve. And we're going to look at all the programs that scored greater than 2 so that we can reveal programs that have a high impact overall on safe community. So I'm going to turn this to greater than 2. Turn that filter on. Make sure all the other filters are off and come back to the main page. And this is interesting. These are all the programs across the city that scored either a 3 or a 4 in safe community. Now remember, they don't end up in quartile 1 or quartile 2 just because they scored 3 or 4 in safe community. These are programs that have an overall high degree of relevance in accomplishing everything that you're trying to do, but it just so happens that they also are highly influential towards achieving a safe community. You also have programs that are in quartile 3 that scored probably a 3 in safe community and probably are singularly focused, don't have the highest degree of influence on other results, and that's how they end up kind of on that bubble into quartile 3 and hardly anything in quartile 4. So high degree of impact on safe community doesn't usually translate itself to being a low priority overall. The majority of your resource allocation here is going towards highly relevant programs.
This is why we challenge you, though, to look at these different perspectives, because in quartile 3, you've got some significant spending on programs that highly help you achieve a safe community, but really aren't helping you achieve anything else. The discussions should be, could we reprogram these so that they are also helping us achieve some of our other results? So it's worth that conversation. It's also interesting to note that you're probably leveraging a significant dollar amount of your budget towards achieving a safe community. And I think that's an important part about this. This is how you represent how much of your dollars are being leveraged in your budget to achieve a safe community. A significant amount of your spending is going to help you achieve this. And so I think it's so important for you to be able to look at this and understand where the programs are and to be able to start articulating what are we doing to offer a safe community. And realize that this isn't just about police and it isn't about fire, but it's about any department. You're going to see transportation, neighborhood resources, your magistrate, law, public utilities. All of those also help you achieve a safe community by virtue of the fact that they are contributing to a way that's been defined on your result map.
So what I did, as John was just describing that this doesn't belong to just one department or another, is I clicked this button that says Generate Program List. So we haven't focused on that functionality, but for any of the arrays that you develop as you're starting to explore your own programs, if you want to actually dig into the array and see what programs we're talking about, you hit this button, Generate Program List, and just down below in the model, you get the entire array of all of the programs that meet the criteria that you've selected. So just like John described, you see a number of departments here that are achieving high scores for safe community, and you get the entire list of these programs and all the data. We have our headings here, which department it comes from, the program name, program number. They're in quartile group always, and then within the quartiles, they're not in rank order, they're in alphabetical order by department. That's how the report comes back. These costs correspond to whatever we've chosen up here in terms of the use of resources. And so since we have direct costs highlighted, those are the costs that show up. We get to see which fund they come from, as well as the FTE. Now, just so you know how this works, as we scroll a little bit further to the right, we see those program costs again, and you see a couple other categories. Here we have portion of the program funded by general government revenue. So those are those general government tax dollars that are used to support the program. And over here we have portion of the program funded by those program-specific revenues that John outlined in terms of fees for service, grants, those dollars that are meant to pay specifically for the program and can't be used in support of other programs. And finally, program revenue collected in excess of program costs. What we're understanding there is for some programs, you might be collecting by way of your fees and charges more than what it costs to actually pay for the program. And so those will be collected, and you'll be able to read them over here in the report. So just wanted to make sure that everybody could see what happens when you generate the program list.
So as Chris turns off the filters, we're going to move to the last iteration of the model, which is the first time someone has used their personnel data to really come up with another lens through which to look at their budget. And we're very excited as we put that data into play and preview this with Greg and Dawn yesterday. It was very exciting to see that there are tremendous amounts of conversation that can occur. And so Chris is going to walk through the final iteration of the model with the filters that have to do with your personnel data.
So the first thing we were able to do is isolate just the costs associated with personnel from the program costs. So what we're looking at here, the exact same overall citywide array, but we're only focusing in on those personnel costs associated with the program, taking out all non-personnel related costs. So this alone was fascinating. We hear from organizations all the time, hey, we're a service industry. Everything that we do relies on our people, and it's very helpful to get a perspective of our programs where we're keying in on just those personnel related expenses. Another thing that you added to your analysis that we were able to incorporate into the program costing were vacancies. So we wanted to understand if there was a position that was currently vacant, how is that position typically used? How does that position usually support your programs? And we were able to tie that particular vacant position to all of the programs that you support. And as those programs went through scoring and ultimately the placement in the model, we can look at a big picture view of where those vacancies reside. So this is completely fascinating. You see percentage of the total budget, sure, that's small. You don't have a lot of, luckily the majority of your organization is not vacant right now. But as we look specifically at the array, this is profoundly interesting information. We have vacancies here in our quartile 1 and quartile 2 programs. So you might ask yourself, these are highly relevant programs. We're definitely concerned about making sure that we provide these programs correctly, but we have vacancies in those programs. How are we going to fill those vacancies? There might be an efficiency to be gained if you can get by without absolutely filling that position. But as we look down towards quartile 3 and quartile 4, this is where it gets interesting. You have current vacant positions where you have lower relevant programs. These are huge opportunity areas to consider. Why do we need to fill that position right away when it's currently vacant? Maybe we can take advantage of the natural attrition that's taking place in our quartile 3 and quartile 4 programs. Lastly, one thing that you might consider is, hey, this is a position that is for a quartile 3 or quartile 4 program. Is this the time to consider, can we reallocate, instead of filling that position and tying up those dollars to fill the position in a lower quartile area, can we take those resources that we would have done that with and reallocate them to support some of our higher priority programs? So that's the first one. Totally interesting. Definitely spend a lot of attention and a lot of time digging into that data. The next one we have is personnel costs for positions that are currently retirement eligible. So you have staff supporting programs right now who are retirement eligible, and as those staff were traced through the programs and ultimately this final array, we can see that some of them serve quartile 1 and quartile 2 programs, and some of them serve quartile 3 and quartile 4 programs. As you look towards succession planning, and you have staff who are probably going to be retiring soon in some of your higher priority programs, you probably are absolutely concerned with how are we gearing up other staff to replace them. These are high priority programs, and you are really concerned about doing that. In lower priority areas, quartile 3 and quartile 4, if someone retires, again, you're looking for that natural attrition, that ability to take advantage of the fact that you're going to have a vacancy that you might not have to refill. Now, here's where it gets interesting for us in terms of retirement eligible positions. If you know, you can already plan for someone who's going to be leaving who currently serves in a quartile 1 or quartile 2 program, how about gearing up staff who are highly talented personnel who happen to be serving some of your lower priority programs? Today they might support a quartile 3 or quartile 4 program, and instead of considering laying them off, you consider retraining them, or at least giving them the first opportunity to move into a higher priority area. So someone's going to retire there. You know you have identified staff who are highly skilled in a lower quartile area. What are your opportunities to recast them, retrain them to fill that higher priority position? And then lastly, we also took one step further from your currently retirement eligible positions and focused on those positions where the current staff member is nearing retirement. So it's a very similar discussion that we just had relative to the retirement eligible position, but here where you have some advanced warning of staff members who are gearing up for retirement. And again, the same discussion, quartile 1, quartile 2, you know this is coming. It's in your near future. How do you plan for it? How do you make sure that you're taking advantage of retraining, recasting highly talented staff from lower quartile programs to take over in these positions that might become vacant? And how do you take advantage of the opportunity, again, to consistently get resources out of those lower priority areas?
And I think where this is so critical is this gives you a forward vision of what you're having to deal with in the next few years, knowing that you want to preserve those programs in quartile 1 and 2 because they're very relevant, they're very important. And so start planning now to be able to say, maybe we've got people internally that where their skill sets will match better, and so we're not having any vacancy created at all. There'll be a natural movement, and we can start divesting ourselves of some of the things that people are doing that aren't as relevant and really make them highly relevant to the organization as well as valued as an employee, and then use this as a planning tool so that we don't just have to start the budget with looking at how we get rid of quartile 3 and 4 resources, but simply over time, how can we start using, as Chris says, that natural attrition in our succession planning to start getting out of those functions and start utilizing those dollars to do things that are much more relevant. So this is an important enhancement. It's got so many interesting things, and we could probably go on for another couple hours, but we know that you have a limited time as well, and we want to give Dawn and Greg time to answer your questions and to talk a little bit more. And again, as we offered, as questions come up, they'll know how to get to us, but if there's a time where we need to all get together and just talk about the results of this model, we'll be so happy to do that. So please know that this has been a wonderful opportunity again to work with all of you, and we look forward to your questions, but we look forward more to hearing how you're going to use this new lens to make better budget decisions. So for now, we're going to sign off and wish you well and wish you happy holidays, because we probably won't be connected with you until after the new year, but simply know that it's been a pleasure, and we look forward to continued opportunities to help Chandler utilize priority-based budgeting in their resource allocations decisions. So have a great day, have a great holiday. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks very much.